Hello, good afternoon, and welcome back to the sunny, brutal, capitalist dictatorship of Petaling Jaya. Happy Sunday to all of you, unless you're a bigot, a reactionary, or a Zionist, in which case I hope you have a very unhappy Sunday. Behind me is University Malaya, Malayan University, that is one of the oldest educational establishments in Malaysia. No, pardon me, it is the oldest university in Malaysia. It was opened up in the early 1900s by the Brits, and in fact, in the 60s, it really saw its peak, with its Chancellor being our first Prime Minister, Tunku Abdul Rahman. Now, at one point, this is really hard to believe, but at one point, University Malaya was a very, very prestigious and sought-after university. You know, if you got a degree from University Malaya, it was the same as getting a degree from any prestigious Western university. In fact, you didn't even need to go to the National University of Singapore, because it was just as prestigious as the National University of Singapore. But what happened? Suddenly, how did it go from being in the top 100 universities of the world to plummeting down to its current state? Although it's still quite prestigious, nevertheless, it no longer enjoys its top 100 reputation, even though some of the brightest minds still teach there, and some of the best students still go to UM. How did its ranking plummet so much? Well, that's what we intend to find out today. Today, I'm going to talk to you about the decline of Malaysia's education. Stay tuned and enjoy the Internationale. Well, this is the UM Specialist Center, and UM is actually a very, very big area. It's not just a university, it's a mini town in itself. It's quite a big place you can explore. And don't get me wrong, I don't want to say that it's a bad university. It's still a very, very respected institution with very respectable people who are teaching there and working there and studying there. But unfortunately, it seems to have lost its glimmer over the last couple of decades, and it's sort of like its reputation, or I should say that its ranking has plummeted throughout the years. And it's not the fault of one particular individual. Well, actually, it is the fault of one particular individual, but not an individual working in this university. So, today's video is actually not really about UM. It's rather about the declining standards of Malaysia's education system, Malaysia's public education system, and why parents are pivoting towards vernacular schools, and what we can do to make Malaysian education great again. Let's go! In my last video, I talked about the paper-thin solidarity of race, and why racial solidarity was really a nonsensical concept. Because not only does it dehumanize people of other races and other groups, but it also makes one fall under the delusion that a person has automatically got solidarity with someone simply because of shared genetic identity, not accounting for the fact that a person of your own race could just as well harm you, persecute you, or even kill you. So there's no guarantee that someone of your own race has your best interest at heart. And unless we can actually unite on something that bonds all of us, well, we're never going to have socialism. I mean, anybody who's worked in the dog-eat-dog corporate world knows for a fact that anybody who peddles racial solidarity is simply peddling childish nonsense. Because in the real world, nobody really cares that you're a fellow Chinese or a fellow Malay or a fellow Indian. In the real world, especially the dog-eat-dog corporate world, people are looking out for their own class interests. And if that means playing racial politics, yes, they will do that. But that doesn't mean that they have solidarity with just about any and every member of their race. It's childish nonsense to assume that they do. But it is material reality that Malaysia is indeed a very, very tribalistic sort of society. People fundamentally see themselves as races, or if not by races, they look at whether you went to a government school, a private school, a vernacular school, and then they decide whether or not they ought to contract friendship with you. I know, and this is partly what led me to the conclusion that racial solidarity was simply childish nonsense. Because, you know, the vernacular school defenders, the most ardent defenders of the vernacular school, would not contract friendship with me, whom they perceive to be a Malayanized banana. Just like, you know, how some Asian American activists are also attacking me as whitewashed. Because, well, the only Asian culture that they know of is East Asian culture. They cannot imagine an assimilated Chinese in Southeast Asia. So they just naturally assume that, you know, Peranakan culture is simply whitewashed Chinese culture. But the fact of the matter is that it's material reality that Malaysia is a very, very divided, tribalistic society. But you know, we were on a very, very good trajectory in the 1950s and 60s. In fact, Malaysia looked to be a very, very promising young and booming nation in the 50s and 60s under the auspices of our first Prime Minister, Tunku Abdul Rahman, who basically united the races and fundamentally created this Malayan identity. How did things go downhill from there? In today's video, I attempt to explore the decline of Malaysia's education system and the fragmentation of Malaysian society into tribalistic groups. As a result, let us begin. Now, this is going to offend a lot of people terribly, but I really mean no offense when I say this, that vernacular schools are indeed a contradiction in modern Malaysia. Why do I say that they are a contradiction? Well, I don't mean to insult them or to insult the people who run them, but their function was primarily to prepare the Chinese diaspora who had just arrived from China in the late 19th century for their return to China from their exodus after the Opium War. There was no such thing as a Malaysian identity back in the late 1800s or the early 1900s. In fact, I doubt that people like Yap Aloy even spoke Mandarin, because Mandarin had not even become standardized until the early 1900s under Sun Yat-sen. Kwan Cheng was created in 1908, and Zhonghua was established in 1919. So they were created to prepare the Chinese for their return back to China, because there was no Malaysian identity back then. Malaysian vernacular Chinese schools are even older than Malay government schools. So with the exception of places like Penang Free School, which was established in 1819, vernacular Chinese schools have well over half a century of a head start compared to government schools. So they are fundamentally a contradiction because the lingua franca of these schools is Mandarin. But the lingua franca of Malaysia is not Mandarin. It is Malay. So in the 1600s, in the 1960s, fundamentally, the goal of Malaysian education was to try and foster a sense of Malaysian national consciousness, and rather than Chinese or Indian or Malay consciousness, the goal of Malaysian education under the first Prime Minister Tunku Abdul Rahman was to create a sense of Malaysian identity. And we were going very well in the 60s. We were progressing very well. You'll be surprised that in the 50s and 60s, in fact, vernacular schools were gradually withering away. And this is going to offend a lot of people when I say that they were already dying a natural death in the 50s and 60s, because most Chinese parents in that time did not want to send their children to vernacular schools because they had no intention of sending their children back to the so-called motherland. I mean, you know, the most popular sorts of schools were English medium schools. And so government schools actually were popular back in those days. But then something happened that would change the course of Malaysian education history forever. Yes, we were progressing very, very nicely in the 50s and 60s. In fact, my late grandmother was an English teacher at a government school herself, and no Malaysian boomer who had gone under the government school education would deign to salang, that means to criticize their teachers. Most Malaysian boomers who went under the government school system agree that government school teachers in that time were indeed dedicated and competent and caring of the students' needs, and that standards have plummeted. But this seems very, very unfair to the current generation of government school teachers who actually have principles and actually want to do the right thing and who actually have good work ethic, because they all seem to be tainted with the same brush as the current incompetents who run our system. But how did these incompetents get there in the first place? Well, as I've said, government schools used to be really, really, really prestigious back in the old days under Tunku Abdul Rahman's premiership. In fact, even Jinping, the Chinese-educated communist leader of Malaya, was going to be sent to a Catholic school in Ipoh. But later on, the war would of course change all that. World War II would of course change all that. But Jinping's parents fundamentally believed that he would get a better quality of education at a government Catholic school than he would at a vernacular school. Because fundamentally vernacular schools do tend to be very, very insular, and they don't really prepare you with cultural sensitivity for understanding people outside of the Sinosphere. When I say Sinosphere, I mean Korea, China, Japan, and Vietnam. Vernacular schools fundamentally have a high standard of education in the sense that they get good grades, but they don't prepare you with cultural sensitivity for people outside the Sinosphere. They're a very insular sort of society. So most parents, even working class Chinese parents, did prefer to send their children to government schools that were English medium, because that would ensure that their children would get a more cosmopolitan and well-rounded education. Not just grades, but what happened? Well, what happened was basically our education system got hijacked by race hustlers. And that's when government schools went downhill from that point. It all started with the tragedy of May 13, 1969, when fascist reactionaries staged a coup d'etat between the Chinese and Malay communities in Malaysia in order to make Tunku Abdul Rahman, our first Prime Minister, look incompetent so that they could oust him. Now, we don't know who exactly instigated the riots, but from that point on, people started gradually to see themselves as whatever race they were first, rather than Malaysian first. And not only that, this was compounded by the fact that the education ministry was taken over by a very racist gentleman by the name of Dr Mahathir bin Mohammed. Mahathir became the education minister in the 70s, and he fundamentally caused the school system to plummet. We were going on a very nice trajectory until his premiership, when he switched the medium of education to Malay, because he felt that that would give the underperforming elite strata of the Malay bourgeois a leg up. Of course, it didn't really, and it didn't help the poorest people in the villages who fell through the cracks of his Bumiputra policies. But nevertheless, Mahathir started injecting ethno-nationalist politics in the school system. And as a result, because Chinese and Indian parents realized that schools in Malaysia were becoming very, very, how do we say, without offending anyone, they were becoming less and less cosmopolitan and more Malay-centric, so to speak. That's how they felt. They gradually started pulling their children out of government schools because they were uncomfortable with what they felt was a racial and religious agenda being injected into government schools. And not only that, even universities in Malaysia, like the National University of Singapore, in the 50s and 60s, was actually one of the highest ranked universities in the world. To get into the National University of Malaya was the same as getting into the National University of Singapore. Yes, it was even more prestigious than the National University of Singapore at one point. But unfortunately, that all changed with Mahathir as our education minister. Because Mahathir also promoted a thing known as crony capitalism, in which relatives of the elite strata of the bourgeoisie were promoted above competent people. And eventually, because of this culture of cables, this culture of political guanxi, so to speak, University Malaya's ranking also plummeted, along with the government schools' ranking. But it's a myth to say that vernacular schools have always performed better than government schools, and vernacular schools will always perform better than government schools. Because if you take the best government schools, like Sri Aman Girls' School or Penang Free School, and you compare them with the weaker vernacular schools that are poorly funded, then you will find that the students in these government schools do perform better than the poorly funded vernacular school students. So this is proof that it's not inherently a cultural thing, or I should say it's not that vernacular schools are culturally superior to government schools. It's just that they have been less influenced by the politics of guanxi. It does exist in vernacular schools. Guanxi does exist, but not to the same extent that it does in government schools. You know, and it's not fair to lambast every government school as being underperforming, because you're also putting down prestigious government schools like the Penang Free School, where Tunku Abdul Rahman studied, or you're also putting down the Sri Aman Girls' School. And Malaysians tend to forget that that was the norm rather than the exception in the time of Tunku Abdul Rahman. But it is funny indeed that a man like Dr. Mahathir would cry foul about the Chinese and Indian community's inability to assimilate, unlike the Peranakans, because apparently they want their own vernacular schools. The Chinese want their own Chinese vernacular schools, the Indians want their own Indian vernacular schools, and they don't want to assimilate in the national system. That is the grievance that many right-wing Malaysian reactionaries have about the ethnic minorities. But they don't seem to realize that it was Mahathir who basically unwittingly revived the vernacular schools by making government schools plummet. Yes, it was Mahathir to whom the vernacular schools owe the pleasure of their existence. And it was Mahathir who breathed the kiss of life into vernacular schools, just as they were about withering away, and Malaysians were gradually forming a sense of Malaysian consciousness rather than Chinese or Indian or Malay consciousness. It was Mahathir who is responsible for the backlash of the ethnic minority communities in boycotting government schools. The more affluent members of the Chinese and Indian communities sent their children to private schools, while the less affluent members who still wanted their children to get a good education, but who didn't want any racial or religious identity politics being injected into the system, naturally sent their children to Chinese vernacular schools. Because although Chinese vernacular schools are insular, they do not involve ethno-religious politics. They don't have any patience for all of that. Malaysians started becoming very insular with the decline of government schools and the injection of race-based politics into these government schools. So you can't blame them for wanting to pull their children out of government schools and feeling suspicious of government schools, because time and again, indeed, there has been a race and religious agenda in them. So when you talk about abolishing vernacular schools and forcing the Chinese and Indians into the government system, that doesn't work because, well, the Chinese and Indians will say in response, can you actually provide a better standard of education than what the government school, than what the vernacular school is providing? Why should we, they ask? And that is a very good question. Why should they? Considering that most government schools have rock-bottom standards as a result of nepotism and crony capitalism and race and religious-based politics. Now, the fact of the matter is that Chinese vernacular schools, as I've said, were withering away gradually, because government schools were actually providing a high standard of education and a cosmopolitan education for the Chinese and Indian Malaysians, that parents didn't feel the need to send their children to vernacular schools anymore. But as I've said, it was people like Mahathir who breathed the kiss of life into vernacular schools by making government schools so unappealing that Chinese and Indian parents naturally sent their children to vernacular schools. So you're not going to convince them by talking about abolishing vernacular schools. You're just going to make them angry. They're going to feel that you're committing cultural violence on them. In the same way cultural violence was committed on the Native Americans by the white settlers. That is how many Chinese and Indians feel in this country, that the Malay Muslim majority is trying to perform cultural violence and forced assimilation on them. Now, whether that's true or not, I cannot say. I can't speak for the Malays. But this is how many people in the Chinese and Indian communities feel. So I'm telling you how, from a minority point of view, that's how many minorities in Malaysia feel. They feel that they are being pressurized to lose their cultural identity and become like me. But the point is, if you want to make government schools popular, you have to address the root cause of the problem. sacked the incompetents, the useless pencil pushers like the Tan Sris or Datuk's wives, who are promoted based on cables, actually promote deserving teachers, and yes, reward people based on merit rather than race or religion. Can you do that? If every government school teacher was as dedicated and competent as my grandmother, I assure you that you would see droves and droves of Chinese and Indian people, except the most fanatically hardcore China first types, moving to government schools. If government schools could buck up and make themselves so awesome that there would be no need for vernacular schools, then they would naturally wither away, crumbled under the weight of their own contradictions. But they are kept on life support by our very own reactionaries who want to abolish them, while hypocritically sending their own children to private or international schools. You notice you never hear these reactionaries in Malaysia complaining about private and international schools. You will never hear Mahathir or any of his friends complaining about international schools. And I would argue that international schools are even more elitist than Chinese vernacular schools. You see? Why don't they? Well, I'll tell you why. Because their own children and their own nieces and nephews go there. That's why you can't attack international schools, because that would be like the snake biting his own tail, you see? But you can target Chinese vernacular schools, because that way you get to play racial identity politics, and then by doing that you just make the Chinese Malaysian vernacular school community angry and more resistant to integration. Now, I've talked about the problems of vernacular schools, like the creation of cultural cliques, like Mandarin-speaking only companies, Mandarin-speaking only cliques at work. But this is not the reason for divisions in our country. This is a symptom of these divisions. Because unless our country can actually have a centralized education system that fosters unity among all Malaysians regardless of race and religion, unless Chinese and Indian parents feel that their cultural sensitivities will be respected under the government school system, and considering there are politicians who are talking about closing down the canteens during fasting month, this is not giving Chinese and Indian parents much faith in the government school system, even though there are no doubt many principled, honest souls teaching there. Unless we can actually see an improvement, a marked improvement in the government school system, vernacular schools are here to stay, because, as I've said, they don't put up with all this racial and religious identity politics nonsense. They don't. They might be insular, they might not be very open-minded, but they also don't have they don't have patience for all this religious identity politic nonsense. You see? And that's why you need to actually win more bees with nectar rather than win them with vinegar. Because if you want to attract parents to the government school, I can assure you that most parents are not like the fanatical Chinese ultras in Malaysia. I know, because I interact with hawkers, I interact with mechanics, I interact with working class Chinese people on a daily basis, and I can tell you, most of them don't have this fanatical, Chinese complex. They don't, for example, believe that their children will lose their Chineseness if they are taught by me, a banana. They will have no problem sending their children to government schools if they can be assured that their children will just get a good education, their children will be well-informed citizens, and their children will not be subjected to racial and religious politicking. Can you do that? If you can't do that, then, parents will naturally feel very, very uncomfortable with sending their children to the national system. is a problem that started with Mahathir. And it is not through Mahathir's politics that you can solve it. You actually need to back up the schools. And you actually need to have a bit of humility and accept that vernacular schools might be doing something right. Instead of demanding that vernacular school teachers just matriculate into the government school and close down the vernacular schools, how about taking some examples from the vernacular schools? A few good examples, like prioritizing academics, focusing less attention on religious and racial identity politics. Can you do that? And just basically, and basically promoting people on the basis of merit rather than guanxi. Can you do that? If you can't do that, then vernacular schools are here to stay, I'm afraid. And you just cannot be so hypocritical as to talk about the abolition of vernacular schools, while at the same time not laying a finger on international schools, because parents will start to ask, how come you're not focused on international schools? How come you're only focused on the vernacular schools? Why are you picking on us? That's how they'll feel. And yes, they have absolutely valid reasons to feel that they're being picked on. You know what I say? I say abolish the international schools. Abolish class-based education first. Abolish, elite bourgeois education. And then we can talk about abolishing vernacular schools. I don't even want to abolish them. I just want them to integrate into the Malaysian mainstream system when it bucks up. But, there is no reason for vernacular schools to exist in modern Malaysia. But there is even less reason for the international schools to continue to exist, because international schools basically are like expat colonies. They are basically pockets where expat children mix among themselves and among affluent locals, away from the general masses of Malaysia. There is no reason for international schools to exist either. So I would suggest, before you talk about abolishing vernacular schools, first abolish international schools and basically publicize the private schools. If expat children want to come to Malaysia, or if expats want to bring their children to Malaysia, they can. But their children have to integrate, and their children have to mix around with the rest of the Malaysian children. There is no reason why expat children should be treated as anything special, and there's no reason why Tan Sri's or Puan Sri's children should be treated as anything special either. In fact, under socialism, Datoks, Datins, Tan Sri's and Puan Sri's will be abolished. Your titles will be abolished under socialism. But first, let's talk about removing the plank out of these politicians' eyes first, before we remove the speck of dust out of the vernacular schools' eyes first, shall we? Yeah, abolish international schools. They have no reason to exist in modern Malaysia anymore, because we are all equal. There's no reason why children of expats from Western countries ought to be segregated from local Malaysian children. Why can't they mix with our children? There's no reason why they can't. And of course, there's no reason why Tan Sri's or Puan Sri's children ought to have a different education system than the general Malaysian masses. So unless you're willing to abolish not only race quotas in places like UiTM, and you're willing to abolish international schools, don't you go talking about abolishing vernacular schools, because it just makes you look like a raging hypocrite. But yes, I stand by my point that international schools are the biggest contradiction in modern Malaysia, and they should cease to exist. And all the funds, as much funds as possible, should be allocated towards training competent teachers fostering competent teachers in the government school, because teachers are the lifeblood of a system. If we can do that, if we can make government schools so exceptionally awesome, as I've said, vernacular schools will simply wither away, starved of their student population. And the fact is that they will not go extinct, but they'll just matriculate into the mainstream system. But first, the first pillar that needs to go is the government school. The second pillar that needs to go is class-based education. Then we can talk about vernacular school abolition. That's the final contradiction that needs to go. All right, thank you everyone. Have a wonderful day.